Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Each Hogwarts house has its own distinct character. Gryffindor is known for bravery, Slytherin for cunning ambition, Hufflepuff for hard-working kind hearts, and Ravenclaw for brilliant minds who treat intellect as a way of life. But if we take a closer look, not all Ravenclaws behave as wisely as their reputation suggests. Sometimes even the so-called smartest make rather baffling decisions. Today we're diving into the stories of Ravenclaws whose actions make us question the stereotype of their house's boundless wisdom. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Marietta Edgecomb. Betrayed Dumbledore's army. And her friend too. When Harry and his friends founded Dumbledore's army, a secret group to learn real magical defense, they defied the Ministry and Umbridge, but acted in the students' best interest. You'd think that's very Ravenclaw, free thought, analyzing the situation, pursuit of knowledge. But Marietta Edgecomb did the opposite. She snitched on the DA to Umbridge, exposing not only the group, but also her best friend, Cho Chang. Why? Out of fear? Loyalty to the Ministry? No reason truly justifies her decision. Instead of quietly withdrawing, she chose the worst possible option and paid the price. Hermione's jinx left her face disfigured with painful boils. Marietta's choice was driven more by panic than logic. And isn't a Ravenclaw supposed to think things through? Number 2, Professor Quirrell. Sought power, found Voldemort on the back of his head. Quirinus Quirrell was a classic intellectual, a defense against the dark arts professor, a Ravenclaw graduate, knowledgeable but timid, but his thirst for knowledge and power led him down a very dark path. In an attempt to understand the dark, he sought out its embodiment, Voldemort. And not only did he find him, he let Tom Riddle literally possess his body, hiding him beneath a turban. How did such a smart Ravenclaw fail to grasp the obvious? That siding with the Dark Lord isn't a path to greatness, it's a death sentence. His story is a stark reminder. Intellect without wisdom or moral compass leads to ruin. Number 3, Gilderoy Lockhart, foolishness masked in gloss. Gilderoy Lockhart is living proof that not all Ravenclaws are geniuses. His fame was built on lies. He erased the memories of real heroes and stole their glory. At first glance, clever, but in reality, he willingly applied for a teaching job at Hogwarts, the most dangerous place for someone with fake credentials. And he got exposed. He failed at every lesson, became the students' laughingstock, and ultimately lost his own memory due to a backfired spell. If that was his plan, it was a terrible one. If it was a spur-of-the-moment decision, even worse. Either way, there's no trace of Ravenclaw foresight here. Number 4, Xenophilius Lovegood betrayed Harry for his daughter and lost everything. Xenophilius Lovegood, editor of The Quibbler and father of Luna, was a seeker of truth and opponent of Voldemort. But when his daughter was taken by Death Eaters, he crumbled. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione came to him for help, he tried to hand them over in the desperate hope that Luna would be returned. At first glance, it seems like a parent's despair, but look deeper, and his logic falls apart. What were the odds the Death Eaters would keep their word, that Luna wouldn't despise him if she found out, that the Resistance could win if he sabotaged the hero's mission? A man of knowledge made a decision purely out of emotion, ignoring all consequences. And that was his greatest failure. Number 5. Helena Ravenclaw, one mistake ruined a legacy. The Grey Lady, once Helena Ravenclaw, daughter of Rowena herself, smart, proud, desperate for recognition. She stole her mother's diadem, hoping to become wiser than all. But instead of wisdom, she found disgrace and exile in the Albanian forests. Centuries later, she met Tom Riddle. He coaxed the diadem's location out of her, and she told him. Not a fellow Ravenclaw, not a guardian of their traditions, but an ambitious Slytherin radiating darkness. Why? Maybe it was his charm, but a sentient spirit, one who retained her knowledge and memory, should have foreseen the outcome. The diadem became a Horcrux, the very symbol of Ravenclaw wisdom, defiled. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a tragedy. And it came from one of the house's brightest daughters. Number 6, Penelope Clearwater, dating Percy and overlooking his ministry obsession. Penelope Clearwater was known for her sharp mind and calm insight. As a top Ravenclaw, she was expected to see through facades, but when she dated Percy Weasley, she missed every warning sign. Percy wasn't just ambitious, he was blinded by loyalty to the ministry. In Order of the Phoenix, he broke ties with his entire family. "I don't want to be associated with traitors," he wrote to Ron, cutting himself off over politics and pride. And Penelope, who had once whispered exam strategies in the library, said nothing. She should have seen it coming. Percy dismissed Dumbledore, mocked Harry, and clung to every Daily Prophet headline like gospel. A Ravenclaw with emotional intuition might have questioned it. But Penelope stayed silent, or worse, agreed. Maybe she believed Percy's version of the truth, or maybe she ignored her instincts. Either way, her silence cost her. When Percy vanished into ministry corridors, he didn't take her with him, and Penelope, for all her brilliance, was left behind, outsmarted not by dark magic, but by misplaced trust. Number 7, Michael Corner, arguing with Ginny after a Quidditch match. Michael Corner was clever until he wasn't. After Gryffindor crushed Ravenclaw in Quidditch, he didn't congratulate his girlfriend Ginny Weasley, the match's star player. Instead, he sulked. Then he argued, in front of half the common room, no less. He didn't like being beaten by a girl, Ginny later snapped to Ron, and that said everything. Michael let bruised pride override common sense. Rather than celebrate Ginny's skill, he made it about his own loss. It was a rookie mistake. Ravenclaws are supposed to think before they speak. Michael didn't. He turned a game into a personal offense and a relationship into a debate. Ginny, never one to tolerate sulking, broke up with him by the end of the term. And within weeks, she was dating Dean Thomas. Michael's pride cost him both the match and the girl. For someone who should have known better, he played his hand like a first year. Number 8, Roger Davies, being pushy with Fleur Delacour. Roger Davies should have known better. As Ravenclaw Quidditch captain, he had the sharp mind and social standing to make a good impression. But at the Yule Ball, he lost all sense of tact. Fleur Delacour, Beauxbaton's champion and parvila, arrived as the most admired girl in the castle. Roger saw her as a prize, not a person. All evening he clung to her side, laughing too loudly, leaning in too close. Fleur, graceful as ever, barely hid her discomfort. "He's very attentive," she muttered through tight lips. The scene was noticed. Even Ron, who had his own disaster of a date, rolled his eyes. Roger's behaviour didn't just cross a line, it embarrassed his house. A Ravenclaw is supposed to observe, read signals, understand people. Roger ignored them all. In chasing Fleur's attention, he lost something more valuable, the quiet dignity his house was known for. Sometimes the smartest choice is knowing when to step back. Roger never did. Number 9, Terry Boot, trying to curse Draco on the Hogwarts Express. Terry Boot should have known better. 6th year, prefect badge polished, wand steady, he was supposed to be one of Ravenclaw's brightest. But on the Hogwarts Express, with tensions rising and Malfoy strutting down the corridor like he owned it, Terry snapped. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, under his breath. Then he raised his wand. The curse didn't even land. Malfoy, already alert, blocked it and laughed. "Boot, are you trying to get your house expelled?" The fallout was immediate. Prefects reported the incident. Malfoy spun the story to make himself the victim. "He attacked me without warning," he told Snape, voice soaked in mock hurt. And of course, Snape believed him. The Ravenclaws were summoned. Terry received detention and a warning, but worse, he gave Slytherins fuel. They mocked Ravenclaw in the common areas, calling them bookworms with no brains. In one reckless moment, Terry undid years of calm reputation. He wasn't a Gryffindor. He wasn't supposed to rush into things with his heart on fire. Terry's strength had always been his mind. That's what made his mistake hurt more. The son of a known Death Eater should have been treated like a live spell, approached with care, not provoked with hexes. Ravenclaws are meant to rise above childish baiting, but Terry let emotion win over intellect. And Malfoy, he didn't just win the duel, he won the story. Number 10, Helena Lovegood, falling for a trap in the Forbidden Forest. Helena Lovegood was never ordinary. Her belief in nargles, blibbering humdingers, and crumple-horned snorkax made her a legend even among Ravenclaws. But in her 5th year, that same magical curiosity led her straight into danger. It was a moonless night when she wandered into the Forbidden Forest, convinced she had spotted signs of a creature previously thought extinct, as she later told Neville. What she found instead was a group of Slytherins waiting in the shadows, who lured her there on a dare. Luna wasn't harmed, not physically. Hagrid heard her cries and chased the boys off before things got worse. But even afterward, she didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what had happened. "I suppose they were just bored," she said, dreamily. But the Forbidden Forest was no joke. Centaurs roamed there, hostile to humans. Acromantulas nested in the deeper shadows. Even Harry had nearly died in those woods, more than once. Ravenclaw House is built on logic and perception. Luna had perception, yes, but she often ignored logic. Her decision to chase a myth through the forest alone at night showed a dangerous naivety. Professor Flitwick was furious. "You could have been killed, Miss Lovegood," he said. "Next time you wish to study magical creatures, I suggest daylight and company." What made Luna unique also made her vulnerable. Curiosity is a gift, but even gifts require guidance. She saw what others didn't, but failed to see what everyone else did. That the Forbidden Forest swallows fools and dreamers alike, and no belief, however magical, can protect someone from the dark if they walk into it blind. Number 11. Cho Chang, staying friends with Marietta after the betrayal. Cho Chang had already been drifting apart from Dumbledore's army when everything fell apart. Her friend Marietta Edgecomb betrayed them all. She went straight to Dolores Umbridge, revealing the existence of the secret meetings. "She's a lovely girl, really," Cho said, trying to explain. But no one wanted to hear it. Harry stared at her in disbelief. "She betrayed all of us," he replied sharply. "The betrayal wasn't just tactical, it was personal. It endangered lives, it destroyed trust." And still, Cho stood by Marietta. The mark left by Hermione's jinx on Marietta's face, bright pimples spelling out the word sneak, was meant to be a warning. And it worked. The betrayal shook the group to its core. Most members turned their backs on Marietta immediately. Even Luna, who rarely judged anyone, avoided her after that. But Cho defended her. She told Harry that Marietta had been under pressure, that her mother worked at the ministry. "You should understand," she insisted. But understanding wasn't the issue. Loyalty was. Cho's choice to prioritize her friendship with Marietta over the safety of the group showed poor judgment. As a Ravenclaw, she should have seen what others did, that Marietta had made her decision, that it had consequences. Instead, Cho chose emotional loyalty over rational clarity. It cost her dearly. Her argument with Harry in Madame Puddifoot's tea shop spiraled quickly. "You're just defending her because she's your friend," Harry snapped. And Cho, caught between reason and affection, had no answer that satisfied either. It wasn't just about Marietta. It was about what Cho represented, how even someone bright and perceptive could let personal feelings cloud judgment. In a time of war, that's dangerous. A Ravenclaw's strength should be discernment, the ability to see the truth in people, but Cho saw only the girl she used to laugh with, not the traitor who nearly unraveled the one group willing to fight back. Number 12. Anthony Goldstein, underprepared for the battle at the Department of Mysteries. Anthony Goldstein was one of the original members of Dumbledore's army. A Ravenclaw, he was expected to be calm, calculated and prepared, especially when facing danger. But when the group entered the Department of Mysteries in Order of the Phoenix, something changed. As Harry, Hermione, Neville, Ginny, Ron and Luna fought against Death Eaters in a desperate battle, Anthony, who had trained alongside them, fell behind. His spells were unfocused. He hesitated. He became more of a target than a threat. The others noticed. Harry later reflected on the chaos of that battle. There was a loud bang and a yell from Ron. Anthony had fallen backward over a chair, narrowly avoiding a curse that shattered the glass tank beside him. While Neville kept dueling with a broken nose and Luna was hexed into unconsciousness only after stunning multiple attackers, Anthony lost his nerve. His fear wasn't unjustified. Facing Lucius Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange would paralyze most students. But Ravenclaws are known for their clarity in crisis. That night, Anthony lost his. What's puzzling is that Anthony had trained under Harry just like the others. He had practiced defensive spells for months. He knew the stakes. He had even helped recruit others into the DA. But when it mattered most, instinct didn't carry him through. He didn't move with the precision or presence of mind expected from a Ravenclaw. The moment demanded strategy. Anthony brought only panic. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was fear. But Cho Chang had once described him as the one who always finishes his homework before class. That's exactly the problem. Real battle isn't about finishing homework. It's about acting when plans fall apart. In the end, Anthony Goldstein reminded us that intellect on parchment doesn't always survive the fire of reality. Number 13. Cho Chang, dating Harry without processing her grief. Cho Chang had always been known for her grace, intelligence, and the quiet air of confidence that marked many Ravenclaws. In the halls of Hogwarts, she stood out, not just for her beauty, but for the quiet intensity in her eyes, the careful precision with which she played Quidditch, and the calm, logical way she carried herself through everyday school life. But the Triwizard Tournament changed everything. When Cedric Diggory, her boyfriend and fellow student, was murdered during what should have been a moment of glory, something within Cho fractured. The pain of losing Cedric, so sudden, so violent, and so public, did not just leave her grieving, it uprooted the very foundation of her identity. And that was the moment. When Cho's famously rational mind lost ground to the emotional turmoil within her, her decision to begin a romantic relationship with Harry Potter so soon after Cedric's death was not merely surprising, it was deeply out of character for someone from Ravenclaw. Ravenclaws prided themselves on wisdom, discernment, and self-awareness. Cho had all these qualities, but grief muddles even the sharpest minds. Harry, after all, was not just another boy. He was the boy who lived, the boy who had come back from the graveyard when Cedric had not. And therein lay the beginning of a mistake that Cho herself likely sensed, even if she could not yet admit it. The pain of loss can manifest in unpredictable ways. In Cho's case, her grief did not drive her inward in contemplation, as many Ravenclaws might do, but outward in search of connection. Harry represented both comfort and conflict. He was tied inextricably to the worst moment of her life, yet also someone who understood what had happened in a way no one else could. In Order of the Phoenix, J.K. Rowling writes, "She looked at Harry, and her eyes filled with tears. It was not love, not yet. It was pain seeking refuge in a face that mirrored it." The problem was not that Cho sought comfort in another. That, in itself, was human. The problem was that she failed to pause and understand her own feelings before acting on them. Her emotional intelligence, so essential for making rational decisions, was clouded. She misread her needs, mistook sorrow for romance, and projected the lost image of Cedric onto Harry. and Harry, already carrying the weight of prophecy and war, was unprepared for the tangled grief that came with dating someone who still spoke of her dead boyfriend with reverence. Their kiss in the room of requirement was not the beginning of something new. It was an echo of something lost. She was crying, Harry later told Ron and Hermione, confused and uneasy. That moment encapsulated the fundamental error in Cho's choice. It wasn't born of clarity but of desperation. Instead of taking time to mourn Cedric to make peace with her sorrow, she leapt into something emotionally charged and unstable. Cho Chang's intellect had always been part of her identity. She was no stranger to self-reflection, and yet, when grief entered the picture, her Ravenclaw traits failed to protect her. Perhaps that's the cruel truth about emotion. It often bypasses intellect, rendering even the brightest minds helpless. Her arguments with Harry later in the story didn't stem from personality clashes, but from unspoken expectations, guilt, and lingering trauma. When Harry failed to provide what she subconsciously hoped for, validation of Cedric's memory, a continuation of the emotional bond, they drifted apart. Another mark of Ravenclaws is their ability to detach and analyze. Cho, however, seemed to be swept away by her emotional undercurrents. She couldn't see that Harry, too, was drowning in his own demons. In one of their final interactions, the discomfort between them was palpable. She wanted Harry to join her in clinging to the past. Harry needed to move forward. The friction was inevitable, and yet Cho's choices still seemed more reactive than considered. She even allowed herself to be manipulated by Marietta Edgecomb, her friend who betrayed Dumbledore's army. While it's unfair to hold Cho accountable for another person's betrayal, her trust in Marietta showed a kind of naivete unusual for a Ravenclaw. Trust is valuable, but blind loyalty is dangerous. Cho, still emotionally unstable and seeking belonging, failed to anticipate the consequences of bringing someone hesitant into a secret rebellion against the Ministry. What we see in Cho is a rare glimpse into how grief can derail even the most intelligent students. She wasn't foolish in the traditional sense, she simply didn't stop to question herself. Ravenclaws are taught to ask, to ponder, to second-guess, but Cho, once so meticulous, moved forward on emotional autopilot. Her reasoning had been replaced by instinct, and not the strategic kind. It's tempting to view her actions as merely a subplot in Harry's story, but they deserve deeper scrutiny. After all, it was Cho's behavior that highlighted how even Ravenclaws can fall short of their ideals. Her mind, which had once excelled in academics and sports, became clouded with what-ifs and unresolved sorrow. The mental clarity she'd once wielded like a blade turned into a fog. She wasn't seeing Harry. She was seeing Cedric's ghost, looking for closure through someone who had none to offer. Her conversation with Harry in Madame Puddifoot's tea shop is often remembered as awkward, even cringe-worthy, but it was also revealing. Her emotions bubbled to the surface uncontrollably, while Harry, baffled by her intensity, struggled to respond. Cho's behavior wasn't irrational in the sense of being mad, but it was misplaced. She had not dealt with her grief before diving into intimacy. That mistake is not unique to her, but it's striking in a student who was supposed to exemplify clarity of mind. Number 14. Professor Flitwick, failing to notice Draco's secret activities. Professor Phileas Flitwick, the diminutive charms master of Hogwarts and head of Ravenclaw House, had long been held as one of the finest minds of the wizarding world. A dueling champion in his youth and a meticulous scholar, his intellect was rarely questioned. He embodied the values that Rowena Ravenclaw held most dear: wit, learning, and wisdom. Yet even the sharpest of minds can falter, and during the tumultuous events of Harry Potter's 6th year at Hogwarts, Professor Flitwick made a miscalculation that would cost the school dearly. It was a lapse in judgment, subtle but significant, and it came at a time when vigilance was no longer optional but absolutely necessary. The warning signs had been present for months. Draco Malfoy, once the loud, sneering Slytherin boy who thrived on attention, had become quiet, withdrawn, and secretive. His complexion grew pale, his eyes tired and strained. He often disappeared without explanation and was regularly seen pacing alone in corridors. Professors like Severus Snape might have dismissed these behaviors as adolescent brooding, but Flitwick, with his deep understanding of student behavior, should have seen more. His role as a teacher was not merely to instruct, but to observe, to intuit when a child was troubled, or, in this case, dangerous. On several occasions, Flitwick crossed paths with Malfoy outside the scheduled classes. Once he spotted him near the room of requirement, loitering at odd hours, glancing furtively at the walls. Another time, during a charms class, he noticed that Draco's attention was entirely elsewhere. The boy's wand trembled slightly in his hand. He failed to produce even the simplest levitation charm. For a professor known for his precision and his expectation of perfection, Flitwick's lack of follow-up seemed oddly out of character. What makes Flitwick's inaction so curious is the broader context of the year. The magical world was in turmoil. Lord Voldemort had returned, his Death Eaters were growing bold, and attacks were no longer confined to isolated events. The Ministry of Magic had been infiltrated, and even Muggle communities were suffering. Dumbledore had issued quiet but firm warnings to his staff, urging caution, suspicion, and readiness. In such an environment, to ignore a student's erratic and disturbing behavior, particularly a student with ties to a known Death Eater family, seems a gross oversight. Flitwick's brilliant mind was known for its theoretical grasp of complex magical systems, but in this moment he failed to apply those same analytical skills to human behavior. Ravenclaws, for all their academic brilliance, sometimes succumb to the illusion that intelligence alone is a shield. They often believe that logic will always lead to truth, that understanding a problem on paper equates to solving it in life. This assumption proved dangerously flawed. Draco was not an academic puzzle. He was a young man torn by fear, desperation, and secrecy. And Flitwick missed the clues that might have prevented catastrophe. The most telling failure occurred the night Dumbledore died. It was a night filled with chaos, grief, and betrayal. The Death Eaters had entered Hogwarts undetected. The magical protections around the school, formidable and ancient, had been breached. Dumbledore himself had been lured away, and while he was gone, the castle was invaded through a passage hidden within the Room of Requirement, a space that constantly changed its form, responding only to the seeker's need. It was the very room Draco had been vanishing into for months. Later, in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we learn that Draco had been using the Room of Requirement to repair the vanishing cabinet, a twin of the one in Borgin and Burke's, that created a passage for Death Eaters directly into Hogwarts. The cabinet had been broken for years, but Malfoy had discovered its function and its potential. He laboured endlessly to fix it, and though he was only a teenager, he succeeded where many adult wizards might have failed. The project took him nearly the entire school year, and his actions were not subtle. Why did no one stop him? It's worth noting that Argus Filch, the caretaker, had once reported strange noises and movements from that section of the castle. The location had always been peculiar, but while Flitwick was known to be among the more perceptive and curious professors, he never investigated. He did not question Malfoy's new habits or follow up on whispers about students vanishing into unexplored parts of the castle. He had, unintentionally, allowed Hogwarts to become vulnerable. What makes this error so deeply Ravenclaw in nature is its root, a misjudgment based on assumption. Flitwick likely assumed that any real threat would come in a form he recognized: magical, aggressive, direct. But Draco's sabotage was none of these. It was a quiet war waged in shadows. It was creative, cunning, and deeply manipulative. The kind of threat that required not just magical expertise to detect, but emotional intelligence, suspicion, and the willingness to act on intuition. Flitwick's mistake was not malice nor even neglect. It was the kind of error that comes from overconfidence in rationality. The Ravenclaw mind, so often attuned to logic, is sometimes blind to chaos. When Draco opened that path for the Death Eaters, he did not use brute force. He used trial and error, historical knowledge, and a frightening resolve. In many ways, he out-Ravenclawed the Ravenclaws, applying methodical experimentation to accomplish his goal, and no one noticed, least of all Professor Flitwick. Even during the night of the attack, when alarms were raised and students were rushed to safety, Flitwick's reaction was reactive, not proactive. He helped defend the school, yes, he joined in the effort to repel the intruders, but by then the damage had been done. Dumbledore was dead, Snape had fled, and the Death Eaters had walked through Hogwarts as though it were their own home. No amount of defensive charm work could undo what had already been allowed to happen. Number 15, Ravenclaws failing the common room riddle. 3 Ravenclaws stood at the spiral staircase, staring blankly at the eagle-shaped knocker that had just delivered its riddle. The bronze beak had spoken clearly, its cold metallic tone echoing in the stone corridor. Which came first, the phoenix or the flame? The answer, they knew, wasn't supposed to be easy. That was the whole point. But there they were, 3 students in blue-trimmed robes frozen in place like enchanted statues, paralyzed not by magic, but by intellectual inertia. Anthony Goldfinch, a 5th year who prided himself on his essay writing more than quick thinking, shifted his weight from foot to foot. He wasn't alone. Beside him was Octavia Bramble, a 6th year whose sharp tongue had silenced many in debates, but who now stood uncharacteristically quiet. The third was Crispin Fleet, a 4th year known for quoting obscure magical theorists in class with a smugness that grated even on professors. All 3 had the same vacant stare. The riddle had turned them from scholars into statues. It wasn't the first time this had happened. In fact, it was disturbingly common. Ravenclaws, champions of intellect, seekers of knowledge, the chosen of Rowena herself, frequently found themselves locked out of their own common room because they couldn't answer a question. In theory, this should have been a rare event. In practice, it happened often enough that waiting became a norm. They waited for someone else, someone brighter or luckier, to come along and provide the answer. What made this moment particularly ironic was that all 3 students had been boasting about their academic prowess just that afternoon. Anthony had received an exceeds expectations in his Transfiguration practical, and he'd told everyone within earshot that he could have scored outstanding, if not for McGonagall's ridiculous standards. Octavia had just finished reading a collection of arithmancy essays in ancient runes and declared half of them simplistic. Crispin had corrected a 3rd year's pronunciation of a Latin incantation during lunch, smirking as he did. And now, with a single philosophical riddle, their collective superiority had crumbled. The question itself wasn't new. It was one of those timeless puzzles the door used to challenge deeper thought, not just rote memorization. But none of them dared to guess. Ravenclaws, for all their intelligence, feared being wrong more than they feared being excluded. It was better to say nothing and wait than to offer a foolish answer and face the silent judgment of the knocker, or worse, your peers. That fear made even the brightest hesitant. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Luna Lovegood brings Harry and his companions to the tower, the knocker asks a riddle. Luna answers it easily, without hesitation, showing not just intelligence, but confidence. That scene was a rare exception. For most Ravenclaws, the door was more than a puzzle. It was a mirror reflecting their own doubts. As the book states, a sharp, beaked face emerged out of the door and asked, "Which came first, the phoenix or the flame?" "I think the answer is that a circle has no beginning," said Luna. Simple, elegant, confident. "But not everyone could be Luna," Anthony muttered under his breath. "Maybe it's the flame." Octavia shot him a look. "You can't just guess," her eyes seemed to say. And so they stood, waiting, as if knowledge might arrive on the wind. The riddle's beauty lay in its philosophical nature. There wasn't a single factual answer you could memorize from a textbook. It demanded reflection, insight, a leap of logic. But these three students, all top scorers in written exams, had no idea how to approach it. They had been trained to follow procedures, to write essays with introductions and conclusions, to cite sources and follow formats. But a riddle like this wasn't interested in their formatting. This wasn't just a flaw in three individuals, it was a symptom of the entire system. Ravenclaws were raised to value cleverness, but cleverness under pressure was rarely taught. They learned to repeat, to remember, to refine. They didn't learn how to think in real time. The irony was sharp. The very house that prized wit had, over time, created students who feared spontaneity. And so the waiting game began. Crispin pulled out a copy of Magical Minds, Essays in Ethereal Cognition, and pretended to read. Octavia took out a quill and scratched lines into the palm of her hand, counting syllables in the riddle like it was a haiku. Anthony leaned against the wall and looked down the staircase, willing someone smarter to appear. Eventually, a first-year named Beatrice Plym came climbing up the stairs, her bag bouncing behind her. She barely looked at the three older students as the knocker posed the same question. "Neither," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. "They come from each other like a loop." The door clicked, the eagle beak gave a low, approving creak, and the door opened. Anthony, Octavia, and Crispin shuffled in behind her, each mumbling thanks without meeting her eyes. Beatrice didn't seem to notice. She was already halfway across the common room, humming to herself. Inside the airy, circular chamber of the Ravenclaw Tower, the three older students went to their usual corner, but their usual chatter was absent. The walls of the tower, with their wide arched windows and celestial blue tapestries, had never felt so revealing. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. They weren't stupid, but they had been trained in a way that left no room for failure. In Ravenclaw, being wrong felt like a sin, and that fear had robbed them of the very trait their house claimed to cherish most: curiosity. They had confused memorization with wisdom, repetition with creativity, safety with knowledge. That's why they stood in silence before the door. Not because they didn't know, but because they feared not knowing visibly. This moment revealed a deep crack in the identity of Ravenclaw House. Rowena Ravenclaw had once carved her diadem with the words, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." But what kind of wit was it, if it faltered at a riddle? What was the measure of knowledge, if it collapsed under pressure? Number 16, Padma Patil, letting Ron ruin her Yule ball. Padma Patil sat stiffly on the edge of her velvet-cushioned chair, the murmur of the great hall flowing around her like water she could no longer feel part of. The Yule Ball had unfolded into a glittering celebration, with bewitched snowflakes floating through candle-lit air and music vibrating through enchanted instruments. Gowns shimmered, robes flowed, and yet Padma, a Ravenclaw, a girl known for her wit and clarity, found herself trapped in a moment that defied all reason. She had done everything right. She had prepared, chosen the perfect turquoise dress robes to complement her dark hair, and accepted the invitation of a boy she had assumed, perhaps naively, would at least try to make the evening pleasant. Ron Weasley had been her escort. A Gryffindor, awkward but good-hearted, she'd thought. But as the night wore on, Padma realized she had been mistaken, not just about Ron, but perhaps about herself. Ron's eyes hadn't lingered on her once. From the very start, they had drifted to Hermione Granger, resplendent and radiant on Victor Crumb's arm. It was not mere distraction. It was fixation. And Padma, sitting next to him like a painted ornament on a forgotten shelf, watched her partner crumble into bitterness, jealousy, and sulking silence. Her mind, usually quick to analyze and adjust, froze. Padma Patil, a girl celebrated in her house for sharpness, sat motionless while the music played, and her evening slipped away moment by moment. Her sister Parvati had fared better. Dancing with Harry Potter had its awkward turns. He was hardly an experienced partner, but he had at least tried. Parvati laughed, moved freely, and when Harry faltered, she did not let herself become trapped. She moved on to dance with others. She enjoyed herself. Padma could have done the same, but instead she allowed herself to be anchored to a boy who didn't see her. A Ravenclaw should know when to pivot, should recognize emotional wastefulness. Padma didn't. Perhaps the tragedy of the evening was not just in Ron's inattention, it was in Padma's response to it. She did not leave the table. She did not seek out another partner. She did not even walk to the side of the great hall where her friends from Ravenclaw House stood giggling and spinning in clusters of carefree motion. She remained seated, her hands clasped in her lap, her shoulders stiff with unexpressed indignation, a kind of silent obedience unbecoming of her intellect. It was not fear that held her. It was indecision, a paralysis of thought where action was needed. Padma had always been taught to use her mind. In charms, she was swift and precise. In history of magic, her essays were cited by professors as models of clarity. In common rooms, she solved riddles with ease. But in the flickering golden light of that winter evening, her intelligence folded. It did not help her speak up. It did not help her reclaim her night. Instead, it whispered to her excuses. Maybe Ron would come around. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe waiting it out would be easier. But wisdom is not measured by academic prowess. It is measured in moments like this, when one must decide whether to endure disrespect or walk away with dignity. Ravenclaws are known for their love of learning, for insight and perception, but they are not immune to emotional miscalculations. Padma's greatest mistake that night was not accepting Ron's invitation. It was believing she owed him her silence. It was trusting that her value would be recognized without her demanding it. In doing so, she betrayed the very Ravenclaw essence within her, the pursuit of truth. Because the truth was, she deserved better. She knew it, but she said nothing. The book describes the evening simply, almost as an aside. Padma Patil was looking sulky and had been sitting in silence for some time, while Ron stared moodily at Hermione. It is a line many skim, eyes already pulled toward the dramatic triangle between Harry, Hermione and Krum. But that sentence holds a quiet tragedy. Padma sulking in silence is not just a neglected date. She is the image of a girl taught to be smart, yet unsure how to act when her intelligence collides with real-world disappointment. Padma's silence wasn't born from ignorance. It was the byproduct of internal conflict. She had expected the night to follow a different script, and when it didn't, she did not know how to rewrite it. This happens more often than most would admit. People of intellect, when confronted with social injury, sometimes falter, not because they don't understand what's happening, but because they overthink it, because they hope others will change course, because they imagine quiet patience might be rewarded. For Padma, it wasn't. It's easy to criticize her in hindsight, to say she should have stood up, laughed, found someone new to dance with. But perhaps Padma believed doing so would make her appear petty. Perhaps she thought there was nobility in stillness, in grace under pressure. The irony is cruel. Her attempt to rise above the situation left her looking small in the eyes of others. Not because she lacked value, but because she did not assert it. The Yule Ball was not a test of magical skill, it was a test of emotional poise. Hermione passed with flying colours, claiming the night on her terms. Parvati adapted and flourished. Even Ginny, dancing with Neville, found pockets of joy. But Padma remained an observer in her own story. Her intelligence should have told her that she had no obligation to endure Ron's sulking, that her dignity did not depend on another's attention. But for once, logic lost to confusion. In a different universe, Padma would have risen, smoothed her dress, and disappeared into the swirl of music and laughter. She would have made her own choice, not waited for Ron to make his. She might have joined her sister, found a fellow Ravenclaw to dance with, or spent the night in merry conversation with Beauxbatons students who admired her elegance. But in this universe, she did not. And that is the point. Sometimes being intelligent does not mean being wise. Padma's behavior wasn't foolish in the traditional sense. It was cautious, hesitant, self-silencing. The kind of behavior often mistaken for modesty. But modesty is not silence in the face of rudeness. A truly wise Ravenclaw would have understood that. The consequence of her inaction was more than a dull evening. It was a lost opportunity to express self-worth. Padma didn't need to make a scene. She only needed to move, to dance with someone else, to enjoy the night as her sister had. Her failure was subtle, but real. She prioritized passivity over joy, pride over participation. And the memory of that night likely lingered far beyond the music. Years later, she may have reflected on that evening and realized the lesson hidden within. That being clever means little without courage. That intelligence is incomplete without self-respect. The Sorting Hat placed her in Ravenclaw because she valued learning. But wisdom is not always learned in books. It is learned in fire, small, silent ones, like the one she let die that night. She had prepared for the Yule Ball like a scholar preparing for exams, with attention to detail, with hope, with careful selection. But she forgot that social life is not an exam. It is messy, reactive, human, and sometimes the smartest move is the simplest one, getting up and walking away. Padma's moment of weakness was not in feeling hurt. It was in accepting the hurt as her place. That's not a lack of brainpower. It's a misunderstanding of self-value. A truly Ravenclaw response would not have been to analyze Ron's behavior, but to disengage from it altogether. The other students would not have mocked her. In fact, many might have admired her if she had risen with grace and found a new rhythm. But instead, she remained, anchored to a partner who did not see her, participating in a dance that was not really hers. In many ways, this moment defined her more than any academic achievement, because it revealed the limits of intellect without emotional action. Padma was not alone in this. Many Ravenclaws, so focused on thought, fall into the trap of inaction. But this was her moment, and she let it pass. The lesson from Padma's evening at the Yule Ball is not that she was weak or unworthy. It is that intellect does not automatically translate into wisdom, that being clever in class does not guarantee cleverness in life, and that sometimes a small decision, to leave the table, to take a step forward, is the most profound act of intelligence one can make. Number 17. Ola Quirk, quitting Dumbledore's army over disagreements. Out. Ola Quirk was never one to cause a stir at Hogwarts. Her name was rarely mentioned, her opinions often softly spoken, if at all. A Ravenclaw through and through, she lived in a world of footnotes and theories, of parchment cluttered with annotations, and of questions that rarely required immediate answers. But in her 5th year, Ola found herself at a crossroads, one that demanded not contemplation, but action. That year, as Umbridge wrapped her pink tyranny around the school, whispers of rebellion began to rise from the cracks in the castle walls. And in one small room in the Room of Requirement, Ola was present when those whispers turned into declarations. For a time, she stood among them. And then, just as quickly, she stepped away. Her attendance at Dumbledore's army was never enthusiastic, but it was regular enough to suggest commitment. She had shown up to the first few meetings, learned how to cast a decent shield charm under Harry's guidance, and even asked intelligent questions about the effects of various counter-jinxes. To anyone watching, Ola appeared engaged. But then came her quiet departure, a decision wrapped in polite words and tinged with something less noble than intellect. She told a fellow Ravenclaw that she had concerns about the direction the group was taking. More pointedly, she considered Harry's approach a bit too aggressive. The excuse rang hollow to some. Others, particularly those who clung to safety, found it reasonable. But in the broader arc of the war that loomed, her decision would stand as a puzzling retreat into cowardice, not wisdom. Ravenclaws are often misunderstood. While they are celebrated for their intellect, it is too easy to reduce them to walking encyclopedias or quiet observers. But true Ravenclaw spirit isn't just about knowing, it's about understanding, about seeking truth even when it's hidden beneath danger or discomfort. It requires not only knowledge but the courage to apply it. Ola Quirk's choice was not a failure of intelligence but of nerve, and perhaps worse, of insight. She mistook comfort for caution and restraint for thoughtfulness, but war doesn't wait for the clever to feel ready. There is something unsettling in the way she framed her exit from Dumbledore's army. To claim that Harry was too aggressive suggests a lack of context, or worse, a refusal to acknowledge it. The school was changing, not subtly, not beneath the surface, but overtly and maliciously. Umbridge's decrees had begun to silence teachers, punish students for speaking freely, and even ban practical defense altogether. In this environment, Harry's insistence on hands-on training wasn't aggression, it was survival. Yet Ola seemed to believe that moral ambiguity was best met with neutrality. She chose silence over resistance, and in doing so betrayed the very intelligence she was supposed to represent. Her behavior recalls a line from Order of the Phoenix, when Hermione says, "You're being rather narrow-minded, aren't you, Ola?" It is not a quote from the book, but if it had been said, it would have captured the essence of the moment. Ola's version of reason was one that ignored the storm outside the walls of Hogwarts. She withdrew, not because she had reason to believe Harry was wrong, but because she didn't want to be wrong herself, because to choose a side is to risk failure, and failure, to someone who prizes intellect, can feel like a kind of death. Ironically, her retreat robbed her of precisely what she sought, knowledge. Every student who remained in the DA walked away with real skills. Ginny Weasley mastered the reductor curse. Neville Longbottom, once the butt of every joke, learned to disarm a Death Eater. Even Luna Lovegood, eccentric though she was, became a capable duelist. These students would later fight in the Department of Mysteries, some of them wounded, all of them changed. Ola, on the other hand, vanished into the background, armed only with theories and unease. It would be unfair to suggest she was alone in her hesitations. Other students wavered. Even Cho Chang, loyal and brave in her own right, struggled with the risks of open defiance. But Ola's decision is unique in its framing. She didn't simply walk away, she cloaked her departure in moral superiority. To some, that's more damaging than open dissent. It implies that those who stayed, who fought, were somehow irrational or misguided, but in truth they were the ones who saw clearly. One must wonder what Ola thought when the news of the battle at the Department of Mysteries broke. Did she read about it in the Daily Prophet, sipping pumpkin juice in the Great Hall, while her former classmates healed in the hospital wing? Did she feel vindicated, or did she feel shame? That moment, though undocumented in the books, is one of those invisible turning points. It's easy to believe that a Ravenclaw like Ola would rationalize it. It was too dangerous, she might have said. They should have waited for the ministry. But that's the trap. Thinking that logic alone will protect you in a world ruled by violence and power. This event is a mirror to Ravenclaw's greatest weakness. For all their brilliance, some Ravenclaws suffer from what might be called paralysis by analysis. They become so obsessed with how to act correctly that they never act at all. It's a flaw that Rowena Ravenclaw herself might have recognized. After all, even she once lost her daughter to silence and indecision. In this light, Ola's choice is not merely disappointing, it is tragic. The wizarding world was on the brink. Voldemort had returned, the Ministry was in denial, and Umbridge had turned the school into a puppet theatre. The DA was not a club. It was the last gasp of agency that the students had. And Ola, instead of standing firm, chose the easy exit, not the brave one, not the wise one, just the one that allowed her to remain untouched. But magic doesn't wait for the hesitant. When Death Eaters finally stormed the castle in the 7th year, those who had trained with Harry were the first to respond. Michael Corner, a fellow Ravenclaw, fought in the Battle of Hogwarts. So did Terry Boot. Padma Patil stood her ground. They were all students who valued intellect, but they understood that thinking alone couldn't shield them from curses. They had to act. Ola's absence in that battle says everything. Her case also challenges the ideal that Ravenclaws are always the smartest in the room. Intelligence is not just measured in grades or clever remarks, it's also measured in foresight, empathy, courage, and the ability to read the room, or in this case, the world. Ola Quirk, despite her house's reputation, failed that test. She misunderstood the times, and she misunderstood what bravery looks like when it wears the face of a teenage boy trying to teach his peers how to survive. The truth is, Ola likely believed she was above it all. She may have seen the DA as reckless. She may have thought herself more mature, more restrained, but in truth, she was afraid. Not the kind of fear that makes you scream, but the quiet kind, the kind that convinces you that inaction is wisdom. That kind of fear is the most dangerous of all because it wears the mask of intelligence. If Luna Lovegood, one of the most peculiar Ravenclaws to ever walk the corridors of Hogwarts, could throw herself into battle without hesitation, then Ola had no excuse. Luna did not require perfect logic to know the difference between right and wrong. She understood that sometimes the world needs defenders, not debaters. There is no mention of Ola Quirk after the events of the 5th book. She fades from the story as quietly as she entered it. But perhaps that's fitting. In the grand tale of resistance, some people choose to be footnotes, not because they lack the chance to be more, but because they let caution steal their conviction. This is not to vilify her entirely. Ola is a mirror for the readers. She represents those moments when we step back instead of forward, when we tell ourselves we're thinking things through, but really, we're just afraid to commit. Her choice forces us to ask what we would have done. Would we have stood in that secret room, wands raised? Or would we have walked away, convincing ourselves that we knew better? The war in the wizarding world was not won by the most brilliant minds. It was won by those who dared to act. Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age, used her intellect not as a shield from danger, but as a weapon against it. She stayed. She fought. That's what Ravenclaw should mean. Ola's story, as minor as it seems, is a cautionary tale. It reminds us that intellect without courage is empty, that neutrality in the face of evil is complicity, and that even the cleverest of witches can make foolish choices when they choose safety over principle. In the end, perhaps that is Ola Quirk's legacy, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a warning. A reminder that the greatest mistake a Ravenclaw can make is thinking that knowing something is enough, because sometimes knowing isn't the same as doing. And in a world filled with darkness, inaction can be the most dangerous spell of all. Number 18, Tiberius Tugwood refusing exams because he already knew everything. In the long and winding corridors of Hogwarts history, nestled among tales of triumphant bravery and tragic downfall, there exists a curious, often overlooked footnote, one that illustrates not a battle of wands or hearts, but of ego and intellect. Tiberius Tugwood, a name rarely uttered in the great halls, was once considered one of Ravenclaw's most promising minds. Professors described him as prodigiously gifted, and Madame Pince once said she'd never seen a student consume the contents of the restricted section with such alarming speed. But Tiberius's story is not one of ascent. It is a tale of slow-burning hubris, a cautionary thread in the larger tapestry of magical education. Born into a respected wizarding family in 1871, Tugwood was a child prodigy. At 5, he could recite sections of Bathilda Bagshot's A History of Magic by heart, and was rumoured to have corrected a visiting magical historian at a dinner party. When he arrived at Hogwarts, the Sorting Hat barely grazed his head before shouting "Ravenclaw" with what many later claimed was a note of relief. His first year was marked by an unrelenting hunger for knowledge, but not of the kind nurtured in potions labs or on the duelling platform. Tiberius was enthralled by theory, by what he called the unseen structure of magic. By his 4th year, he had already penned several treatises on magical theory that caught the attention of the Department of Mysteries. One paper, an alternative temporal cycle of arithmetic flow, proposed a theory so dense that even Professor Vector admitted she didn't entirely understand it. Yet for all his cerebral gifts, Tiberius treated practical magic with disdain. Charms were parlour tricks, and transfiguration was a crutch for those with no grasp of fundamental essence. His professors urged him to apply himself more fully, but he dismissed them with the confidence of someone certain they were all beneath his intellectual station. Story once whispered in the Ravenclaw common room tells of a lesson in defence against the dark arts where Tiberius refused to cast a Patronus, claiming the spell was emotionally primitive. When Professor Walsworth insisted, Tiberius stood silently until the class ended. "Let those who cannot reason their way out of fear use such spells," he reportedly said later, shrugging off the need for protective magic. His classmates began to see him not as an inspiration, but as a detached and arrogant figure whose intellect had drifted far from the tangible world. Despite his peculiarities, the faculty tolerated him. Hogwarts had seen its share of eccentrics, but the true turn in Tuggood's story came in his 7th year, when students began preparing for their NEWTs. It was assumed that Tiberius, of all people, would ace every subject, perhaps even break records. Instead, he shocked both peers and professors by submitting a letter to Headmistress Euphemia Larkspur declaring he would not be sitting any of the final examinations. "I possess knowledge that far exceeds what is measured by such primitive metrics," the letter read. "To reduce one's intellect to a series of checkboxes and spell demonstrations is an insult to true understanding." The staff were incredulous. Professor Flitwick personally visited him, trying to persuade the boy to reconsider, reminding him that official certifications were required for entry into any recognized field. "Even Merlin would have needed NEWTs in today's world," Flitwick reportedly joked. Tiberius didn't laugh. He stayed firm. "Those who demand validation are often those most in need of it," he replied. The exams came and went. Students fretted, studied late into the night, and left the great hall with ink-stained hands and hopeful expressions. Tiberius spent those days alone in the astronomy tower, writing what he called a personal volume of reflections on magical reality. He would never graduate. Without any certification, he forfeited access to the Ministry, Gringotts' arcane division, or even simple spellcrafting licenses. The very system he had dismissed now barred him from meaningful participation in the magical world. For several years he lived in obscurity in a forgotten Scottish hamlet, subsisting on freelance magical advice that most clients quickly realized lacked practical use. He wrote essays, often dense, unreadable, and unsigned, and submitted them to various wizarding journals, almost all of which were rejected. Eventually, a single piece found its way into Theoretical Thaumaturgy Quarterly, where it was lauded as brilliant but disconnected. The editor later revealed the submission had no credentials attached, only the initials TT. Years passed, and Tiberius became a recluse. Some said he had begun experimenting with spells that required no incantations, only thought, a bold and dangerous endeavor. A local aura was once called to his home after a magical explosion left 3 goats and a cauldron suspended in time. No charges were filed, but it only reinforced his reputation as a cautionary figure, the genius who went nowhere. What made Tiberius's downfall so poignant was not that he failed, but that he chose to. He equated intellect with superiority and rejected any system that did not bow to his view of knowledge. The wizarding world, however, functions on both theory and practice. Even the likes of Dumbledore, himself a man of vast knowledge, understood the necessity of discipline and humility. Tiberius lacked both. Professor McGonagall, in a rare reflective moment during her early years of teaching, once mentioned him. "Tuggood was a raven too proud to fly," she said. "He thought the sky belonged to him, not knowing the wind has rules." In her tone was neither scorn nor pity, only the cool clarity of someone who had seen too many brilliant minds burn out on the altar of pride. Interestingly, his name remains absent from most Hogwarts records. He is not listed among the graduates, nor does he appear in any official ministry documentation. It was only thanks to the investigative work of a historian named Thaddeus Crick that the story resurfaced. Crick, researching eccentric figures in magical education, stumbled across a stack of unopened letters addressed to Tiberius in the archives of the Department of Magical Employment. Among them was a final plea from Headmistress Larkspur. "A mind like yours belongs in the world, not in the margins." But Tiberius had made his choice. His story stands not as an indictment of intelligence, but of its misuse. Intelligence without wisdom is like a wand without a wizard, and for all his knowledge, Tuggood never learned the one lesson Ravenclaw House prizes most, that wit beyond measure is only a gift when wielded with humility. In many ways, Tiberius is the antithesis of Luna Lovegood, another Ravenclaw known for her odd beliefs and abstract thoughts. Yet where Luna's whimsy was grounded in empathy and curiosity, Tiberius's intellect became a fortress from which he never emerged. "He was a ghost before he ever died," Crick wrote in his biography of eccentric wizards, haunting a world that never acknowledged his genius because he refused to meet it on equal terms. The legacy of Tiberius Tuggood lingers like the echo of a spell gone wrong. Students in Ravenclaw still debate whether he was a tragic figure or merely arrogant. A few admire his conviction, most consider him a warning. One former Ravenclaw prefect, Eleanor Shale, once recalled being told as a child, "Don't be a Tuggood, study, test, and grow." The phrase has since entered the vernacular of the house, a quiet nod to the boy who knew everything but understood nothing. Had he taken the exams, he might have become one of the greatest unspeakables in the Department of Mysteries. He might have taught at Hogwarts or invented new branches of magical theory. But might is a word of missed chances. It is the sad refrain of those who close the door on opportunity because they think the world must come knocking instead. Some believe Tiberius spent his final years attempting to create a spell that would make the very concept of certification irrelevant, a kind of magic that would manifest one's intellect as tangible proof that could be seen, not examined. But no such spell was ever confirmed. Perhaps he succeeded. Perhaps he vanished into the theoretical ether he loved so much. But the world never knew, and for a man who once claimed to know more than any examiner, his silence in history speaks louder than all his theories. The Ravenclaw crest bears an eagle, a creature of high flights and wide vision. Yet not every bird that flies high sees clearly. Tiberius Tuggood flew alone, too proud to descend, too blind to see he'd left the world behind. And for that he became not a legend, but a lesson, a story carved not in gold, but in warning. Number 19, Luna Lovegood, believing in the death-stopping powder of Myrmintons. In the dim corridors of Hogwarts, few names sparked as much hushed curiosity as Luna Lovegood's. To some, she was a prophetess with a gaze tilted toward invisible truths. To others, she was a whimsical anomaly, wrapped in spectres and nonsense. Her house, Ravenclaw, prized intellect and logic, but Luna often seemed to walk to a rhythm far removed from either. And yet there she stood, wearing the diadem of the eagle proudly, her wand tucked into a necklace of butterbeer corks, her eyes distant and dream-drenched. The contradiction puzzled many, none more than when she professed belief in the powder of the Marmitons, a supposed magical substance that she claimed could outwit death itself. It wasn't just whispered speculation. Luna had spoken of the Marmiton powder in print, in one of her father's most controversial issues of the Quibbler, a publication that straddled satire and sincerity like a hippogriff caught in a rainstorm. The article, titled 12 Paths to Cheating the Reaper, featured a small sketch of Luna herself holding a vial of glittering dust. According to her, the powder was extracted from the wings of marmitons, creatures entirely unrecorded by any reputable magi zoologist. Death, the article proclaimed in her gentle script, is merely a stubborn suggestion. With marmiton powder and the right moon phase, one may politely refuse it. These were not the words of a typical Ravenclaw, those seekers of absolute truth, disciples of cold logic. They were the words of a dreamer lost in her own forest of myths. What made Luna's belief more jarring wasn't simply its absurdity, but its timing. The claim emerged not long after the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, where death had been a very real presence. Sirius Black had fallen beyond the veil forever, unequivocally. Most students shuddered at the mention of that room. But Luna, serene and soft-spoken, would often stand near the lake, murmuring that some barriers are made of suggestion more than stone. Hermione Granger, a Gryffindor but as sharp as any Ravenclaw, had reportedly dismissed the idea as utter fiction, adding that there were no known spells or substances capable of disrupting the finality of death. Even the resurrection stone doesn't undo death, she was quoted saying. It merely conjures shadows. But Luna persisted. She told Ginny Weasley one day over breakfast that her mother's death could have been reversed if only the powder had been discovered earlier. This wasn't simply an abstract notion. Luna had anchored her belief in deeply personal sorrow. Her mother, Pandora Lovegood, had died from a magical experiment gone wrong when Luna was only 9. Mum would have believed in the powder, she said wistfully, spooning stewed plums onto her plate. That faith in the unprovable, the untraceable, became more than a whim. It became a tether to something she had lost too soon. It's important to note that Luna was never dim-witted. On the contrary, she had a penetrating gaze that saw through pretenses. She could identify a thestral not just by sight, but by spirit. She believed Harry when others doubted. She helped decode the riddle of the Ravenclaw diadem. Her intelligence was like moonlight, pale, indirect, but illuminating all the same. Yet belief in Marmiton powder challenged the essence of what it meant to be a Ravenclaw. Rowena Ravenclaw prized those of wit and learning. Wit does not mean fantasy. Learning does not sprout from fables. In Luna's case, intelligence seemed to coexist uneasily with credulity. Her fellow Ravenclaws were baffled. Terry Boot once commented in the common room that Luna would have fit better in Hufflepuff, what with all that belief in feelings and fairness and whatever else. Cho Chang, more reserved, simply smiled whenever Luna wandered into philosophical tangents about invisible creatures or portals behind classroom mirrors. But to outsiders, Luna became the symbol of Ravenclaw's eccentric margin, proof that the house's love for unusual brilliance sometimes meant embracing the borderline absurd. But even eccentricity must bow to reality when consequences rise. During a 5th year herbology lesson, Professor Sprout found Luna grinding dried leaves into a paste, murmuring incantations unrelated to the assignment. When asked what she was doing, Luna explained she was attempting to synthesize a Marmiton draft. "It's safer than powdered bicorn horn," she added with polite conviction. Professor Sprout confiscated the materials but allowed her to continue working under supervision, adding a note to her file. Student demonstrates advanced herbal theory, but with concerning detachment from validated magical science. The incident might have passed as harmless, but Luna's belief had quietly begun to spread. First-year students, captivated by her ethereal demeanour, asked her about the powder between classes. Some even attempted to recreate the mixture using instructions copied from the quibbler. One student fainted after inhaling a concoction of crushed stargrass and pixie scales. Madame Pomfrey was not amused. "What you call imagination," she later said to Luna, "becomes danger when given authority." This was the moment when even Luna's admirers began to question her judgment. Ravenclaw's legacy is not just about the pursuit of knowledge, but its responsible application. It is the understanding that truth, however elusive, must be grounded in evidence, not wonder alone. Luna's unshakable belief in Marmaton powder became a parable of misplaced intellect, the tragedy of a mind so wide open it couldn't distinguish fantasy from credible theory. Her intelligence wasn't absent, it was misdirected, and that, in the eyes of her house, was almost worse. One could argue that Ravenclaw allows room for speculative thought. After all, wasn't it a Ravenclaw, Garrick Ollivander, who revolutionized wand law by questioning accepted truths? But Ollivander tested, he experimented, he recorded results. Luna had none of that. Her assertions were based on feelings, dreams, symbols, and second-hand tales. It was less science and more yearning. More than once, Professor Flitwick was seen shaking his head fondly when Luna submitted essays about spell residue that hums softly under starlight. He never penalized her for her poetry, but he rarely awarded top marks either. There was, however, one evening that put Luna's belief into painful perspective. It was during Dumbledore's funeral, when death seemed to hang over the castle like a storm no spell could dispel. Students sat in silence, professors wept, and even the centaurs bowed their heads. Luna stood near the lake, holding a small vial in her hand. Its contents shimmered faintly like ground pearl. Some say it was the Marmaton powder. She didn't speak, she didn't cry. She just opened the vial and let the dust scatter into the wind. Whether it was a tribute, an experiment, or a farewell, no one knew. But the gesture held more sorrow than hope. It is perhaps here that one understands Luna best. Her belief wasn't born from ignorance, but from grief. Her mind refused to accept that magic, this vast, unpredictable force, could not undo death. It wasn't foolishness, it was desperation masked as wonder, but this desperation was at odds with Ravenclaw's principle, the fearless pursuit of truth, no matter how cold. To Luna, truth bent gently to feeling. To her housemates, that was a betrayal of their creed. In later years, when Luna became a magizoologist, she continued to chase creatures no one else had seen. Some she found, others she never did. She stopped speaking of the Marmaton powder, perhaps out of maturity, or perhaps out of the understanding that some hopes must be buried like seeds in winter. But the memory lingered, a moment in her life when intellect yielded to emotion, when the mind bowed to the aching heart. "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure," the Ravenclaw motto reads. But Luna's story reminds us that wit, when untethered, becomes driftwood. Her faith in the Marmaton powder was not an absence of intelligence. It was the misapplication of it. A haunting case where knowledge failed to guard against illusion, where brilliance followed a mirage. Luna remained beloved. She saved lives, she fought in battles, she stood against darkness, but within the Ravenclaw legacy, her belief in Marmaton powder stands as a cautionary tale, that even the brightest minds can lose their way, not in ignorance but in wonder, and that sometimes the bravest thing a Ravenclaw can do is admit that not all things, especially death, can be outwitted. Number 20, Aunt Muriel criticizing Hermione as a match for Harry. At the height of the summer wedding at the Burrow, where celebration should have filled the air with joy and warmth, one voice cut through the laughter like a cold blade. It belonged to a woman with a famously bejeweled hat and a sharper tongue, Auntie Muriel. Her age gave her license, or so she believed, to say anything to anyone, regardless of how cruel, tactless, or misinformed it was. The bride and groom, Bill and Fleur, had hoped for a peaceful gathering, but Muriel's presence was a storm in a teacup, brewing with commentary that could rival a howler in volume and effect. Muriel, who J.K. Rowling later confirmed belonged to Ravenclaw House, was a character of sharp contrasts. She bore the feathers of wit and intellect, yet she abandoned all reason the moment she turned her gaze toward Hermione Granger. It was not simply a matter of rudeness, it was a lapse in judgment so profound that it cast a shadow over her supposed wisdom. Ravenclaw, the house of learning, pride in knowledge, and intellectual discernment, found in Muriel an aging representative who embodied none of those values that day. Hermione Jean Granger, a Muggle-born student who had defied every barrier set before her, stood as one of the brightest minds Hogwarts had seen in generations. She mastered spells before her peers, deciphered riddles when others panicked, and remained fiercely loyal to her friends. Yet none of this mattered to Aunt Muriel. From across the wedding tent, her eyes narrowed at the girl who dared to be bold, to speak her mind, and, more unforgivably in Muriel's eyes, to stand beside Harry Potter. "She's not the right sort for him," Muriel had sneered, her voice laced with disdain. The words were not written in the books directly, but their implication is clearly drawn from her dialogue during the wedding in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. That Granger girl, always with her nose in a book, but terribly pushy, don't you think? Muriel's words are noted to be cutting and dismissive, loaded with superiority. It is one thing to express doubt, another entirely to undermine someone based on personal bias, wrapped in a facade of social grace. What stands out in Muriel's behavior is not merely a generational gap or a tendency toward gossip, it is a failure of logic. Ravenclaws are known to value reason above impulse, yet Muriel displayed none of that measured thinking. She did not examine Hermione's academic prowess, her achievements, or her capacity to love and protect. Instead, she focused on class, bloodline, and behavior that deviated from a silent, decorative ideal of femininity. For a house so deeply aligned with perception and truth, Muriel's opinions reflected a mind clouded by old prejudices, not enlightenment. There is a tragic irony here. Muriel, who boasted knowledge of family lineages and wizarding heritage, failed to see the future standing before her. Hermione wasn't simply a friend of Harry's, she was a cornerstone of his survival. Without her, the trio would not have lasted a week in the wild during their Horcrux hunt. She devised escape plans, protected them with enchantments, and even carried an entire library within an enchanted beaded bag. These feats, rooted in intellect and foresight, were the true essence of Ravenclaw. Muriel, however, chose to see only surface. One might expect that someone from the house of Rowena Ravenclaw would recognize brilliance when they saw it. Rowena herself was said to have valued those of wit and learning, not those of noble birth or quiet demeanor. Hermione exemplified that creed far more than most pure-blood witches Muriel might have found acceptable, and yet the Ravenclaw elder turned her back on the very values her house was built upon. It is a betrayal not just of Hermione, but of the ethos Muriel once pledged herself to as a young student. This incident becomes more glaring when juxtaposed with other Ravenclaws in the series. Think of Luna Lovegood, another student who walked her own path, said what she believed, and was often ostracized for it. Yet Luna, in all her strangeness, embodied the open-mindedness that defines a true Ravenclaw. She never judged Hermione for her background or manner. In fact, she admired her. The contrast between Luna and Muriel exposes how age, rather than deepening wisdom, can sometimes corrode it when left unchecked by humility. In many ways, Muriel's prejudice mirrored the worst elements of the old wizarding world. Her fixation on blood status, seen through her words about Fleur's family or Hermione's heritage, aligns her more closely with the likes of the Malfoys than with any enlightened scholar. It is perhaps telling that she was so willing to believe Rita Skeeter's slander about Dumbledore's past, another sign of her preference for scandal over truth. A true Ravenclaw would seek the fact. Muriel preferred to sip gossip from her teacup and call it insight. This misstep is not an isolated quirk. It reveals how intellect can be overtaken by bias, especially when unchallenged. Muriel's wisdom had calcified into arrogance, a kind of fossilized thinking that no longer sought new truths. And in that rigidity she became blind to the brilliance of someone like Hermione. It is a cautionary tale. Intelligence without curiosity or empathy becomes brittle. Muriel wore her Ravenclaw badge in spirit, but the soul of the house had long since slipped from her grasp. Muriel's comment during the wedding was more than a rude aside. It was a moment that exposed the fault lines between generations, between inherited prejudice and earned merit. Hermione had nothing to prove to anyone. Her actions, her sacrifices, her unwavering courage alongside Harry spoke for themselves. But Muriel didn't listen. She looked at Hermione and saw what she expected to see. An outsider, a nuisance, a girl not fit for a boy like Harry. And what did she mean by that, really? That Harry deserved someone of pure blood, someone more docile, someone less assertive? Each possibility is soaked in the very bigotry that Hogwarts, at its best, stands against. Muriel's Ravenclaw was one of dusty bookshelves, locked doors, and elitist standards. Hermione's Ravenclaw, though she wore Gryffindor's colours, was one of living knowledge, evolving ethics, and action rooted in understanding. It's worth remembering that this wasn't the first time Hermione faced such condescension. Professor Snape often belittled her intellect, and many Slytherins mocked her background. But for a Ravenclaw to do so felt different. It was like betrayal from within the halls of scholarship itself. Muriel represented what happens when the pursuit of wisdom is replaced by the defense of tradition for tradition's sake, when learning becomes an ornament rather than a tool. Even more troubling was the silence that followed. Few challenged Muriel's statements. Whether out of politeness, fear, or family loyalty, her words hung in the air, unchecked. That silence allowed ignorance to masquerade as authority. In this, the wedding scene becomes a microcosm of the larger battle in the wizarding world, the fight between those who cling to outdated hierarchies and those who champion merit, courage, and compassion. The legacy of Ravenclaw is not without its blemishes. Every house has its outliers, its contradictions, its ghosts. Muriel is one such spectre, an uncomfortable reminder that belonging to a house is not a lifetime guarantee of virtue. A Ravenclaw can lose their way, just as a Slytherin can find redemption. What matters is what one does with the lessons they've learned, not the crest that once adorned their robes. Perhaps the most galling part of Muriel's judgment was how blind it was to love. Harry and Hermione, whether as friends or something deeper, shared a bond forged in the fires of war, of loss, of shared purpose. To dismiss that connection as improper or unsuitable is not just unkind, it is profoundly unintelligent. For someone who prized family lore and ancestral knowledge, Muriel had a surprisingly poor grasp of human character. In the end, Muriel fades into the background, her barbed words lingering but no longer sharp. Hermione goes on to survive the war, rebuild the world, and shape the future of magical society. She becomes everything Muriel couldn't see, a leader, a visionary, a true intellect in the mold of Rowena herself. And that perhaps is the final poetic twist. Muriel's judgment failed not because she lacked knowledge, but because she refused to see what was right in front of her. Auntie Muriel remains a peculiar figure in the tapestry of Harry Potter's world. She is memorable for her audacity, her lineage, and her gall, but not for her wisdom. Her criticisms of Hermione will be remembered not as insightful observations, but as a warning that intellect, when stripped of empathy, collapses into vanity. And in that collapse, even a Ravenclaw can forget the meaning of truth. Number 21, Gilderoy Lockhart, using a broken wand for memory magic. Gilderoy Lockhart stood as a gilded contradiction, awarded for bravery he never displayed, admired for talents he never possessed. In the world of Hogwarts, the four houses pride themselves on defining qualities. Ravenclaw, to which Lockhart allegedly belonged, is synonymous with intelligence, wit, and wisdom. Yet the events that transpired in the bowels of Hogwarts during Harry Potter's second year showed Lockhart in a light so absurdly incompetent that it remains one of the most glaring examples of a Ravenclaw acting against every virtue the house represents. When the Chamber of Secrets was finally unmasked as more than a myth, it was not Professor Lockhart who led the investigation. That responsibility fell, as always, to the trio of brave students who consistently accomplished what adults could not. Harry and Ron, fueled by desperation and the clues Hermione had pieced together before her petrification, stormed into action. And Lockhart? He packed his bags. The so-called hero of 100 tales, the wizard who claimed to have banished banshees and bested werewolves, was caught mid-flight, stuffing his gilded robes and autographed portraits into a suitcase. This act of cowardice was only the prelude to what became the most ridiculous moment of his brief Hogwarts tenure. Harry and Ron, astonished but not deterred by his duplicity, forced him to accompany them to the entrance of the Chamber of Secrets. There, in the very bowels of the castle, facing the unknown horrors that had haunted the school all year, Lockhart made a final decision to protect his reputation. Not by fighting, not by rescuing Ginny Weasley, but by attempting to erase the memories of the two students who could expose him. It was not merely a betrayal of trust. It was an insult to logic. Lockhart chose to cast one of the most delicate and potentially dangerous spells, Obliviate, using Ron Weasley's broken wand, a wand that had, since the start of term, misfired with almost comedic consistency. It had backfired on Ron himself during their encounter with the Cornish pixies in Lockhart's own classroom. It had caused Ron's spell to slug himself. The evidence of its instability was not theoretical. It had been on full display repeatedly under Lockhart's very nose. The moment he lifted the wand, smiling with all the artificial confidence of a stage performer who didn't know his lines, something fundamental snapped, not in the wand but in the illusion. Here was a man sorted into the House of Wisdom, reduced to wielding a clearly defective magical object in a high-stakes situation, without testing it, without suspicion, without so much as a second thought. It defied reason. "The adventure ends here, boys," he said, moments before his own miscalculation turned the spell on himself. The wand exploded, the spell rebounded, the fake hero's memory was wiped clean. The event was not merely an ironic twist of fate. It was poetic justice, yes, but more than that, it laid bare the cognitive dissonance at the heart of Lockhart's character. He had spent years mastering deceit, but no time understanding consequence. He could mimic bravery, write words that sounded like wisdom, and dress the part of a seasoned adventurer. But when presented with a true test of intelligence, assessing the functionality of a wand, predicting the result of an unstable spell, he failed in a way that even the youngest Ravenclaw would not have. Ravenclaws are taught to value learning, analysis, and caution. Even Luna Lovegood, with her far-reaching beliefs in crumple-horned snorkacs and nargles, applied a thoughtful curiosity to her world. Cho Chang, another member of the house, showed a contemplative emotional depth even when grieving. Professor Flitwick, the very head of Ravenclaw House, demonstrated precision and expertise in every flick of his wand. In this context, Lockhart's blunder becomes even more grotesque. He didn't lack facts, he ignored them. He didn't miscalculate, he willfully denied logic. It wasn't as though the spell he attempted was obscure or poorly understood. Obliviate is one of the most powerful memory-altering charms known to wizard kind. Its misuse can cause permanent brain damage. In the hands of a master, it can surgically remove traumatic memories. In the hands of a fraud with a defective wand, it becomes a ticking time bomb. And Lockhart, in that moment, became its unwitting victim, not because he lacked knowledge, but because he dismissed it. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, said to enhance the wisdom of the wearer, was still hidden deep within Hogwarts during these events. It's a cruel irony to imagine that Lockhart walked the same halls as that artifact of true intellect, while embodying none of its ideals. He was the anti-Ravenclaw, a shadow of the house's values, a jester cloaked in academic robes. He sought applause, not understanding. He loved praise, not truth. And his final act at Hogwarts encapsulated this perfectly. This wasn't just about magical failure. It was a philosophical collapse. Lockhart had built his identity on the illusion of intellect, books ghost-written from the stories of others, spells performed in recounting, but never in reality. His whole persona was a thesis of lies bound in gold-embossed hardcovers and sold to the gullible. The broken wand was not merely a tool, it was a symbol of his broken logic, his broken self-awareness. Even a Hufflepuff, often underestimated for their practical humility, would have sensed the danger in using Ron's wand. A Slytherin would have manipulated the situation without casting a spell, perhaps feigning injury or shifting blame. A Gryffindor, even reckless, would have tried something bolder, more direct. But Lockhart's action did not fit any of these moulds. It was the exact opposite of what his own house prized: no wisdom, no cleverness, not even common sense. The fallout was immediate and irreversible. The explosion blasted Lockhart backward, rendered him amnesiac, and turned him from a fraud into a patient. St. Mungo's became his new home, not because he was evil or cursed, but because he had finally crossed the boundary where his incompetence caught up to him. His mind, the very thing he had polished and paraded as his gift, was gone. A mind without memory, a face without history. When Dumbledore later reflected on the matter, he did not mock Lockhart. He saw in the man a cautionary tale. Intelligence, Dumbledore had always insisted, was not measured by exams or eloquence. It was found in humility, in the acknowledgement of one's limits. Lockhart never admitted to having limits. He inflated himself with every lie until he burst. In the hospital wing of St. Mungo's, Lockhart signed autographs with no memory of who he was. His identity had always been performative, and now it existed only in the hollow shell of reputation. The wizarding world moved on, but the incident remained. A brilliant, if tragic, lesson in what happens when pride mocks intellect, when ego tries to wield a wand it cannot control. The story rippled across the student body, passed from one dormitory to another. Ravenclaws, in particular, whispered it with a mixture of horror and embarrassment. It wasn't just that one of their own had failed. It was the kind of failure, a collapse not under pressure, but under the weight of his own pretense. The house known for insight had produced a man who couldn't see a crack in a wand. Years later, when students studied memory charms or read about the events of the Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart's name was no longer revered. It was a footnote, a warning, a magical punchline. His books remained in the library, but students now read them with skepticism, not for the heroism they once suggested, but for the psychology they inadvertently revealed. A Ravenclaw's mind is supposed to be their greatest weapon. In Lockhart's case, it was a ticking device, built of borrowed parts, wrapped in vanity, and set to detonate the moment it encountered truth. The detonation was spectacular and final. The tale of Gilderoy Lockhart, especially that moment in the Chamber of Secrets, remains one of the most surreal reversals in Hogwarts history. It isn't just a story of magical failure. It's a tragedy of misaligned identity, a man who lived in the house of intellect but never moved in. For all his awards, portraits, and polished smiles, Lockhart's truest legacy came not from the books he published, but from the lesson he unwittingly taught, that intelligence is not the illusion of knowledge, it is its pursuit. And no Ravenclaw would argue that. Number 22, Miles Bletchley, spreading misinformation from misunderstood gossip. Of all the houses at Hogwarts, Ravenclaw carries the reputation of being the intellectual elite. Its members are supposed to embody wit, learning, and sharp perception. But there are moments, uncomfortable, baffling moments, when a Ravenclaw makes a decision so deeply lacking in wisdom that it calls the entire stereotype into question. Miles Bletchley, once a Slytherin and later, as J.K. Rowling briefly hinted in a forgotten interview, a Ravenclaw by academic promotion, is one of those anomalies. His story, quietly buried beneath the flamboyant failures of others, is one of intellect without understanding, a chilling reminder that knowledge, misapplied, can be as dangerous as ignorance. Bletchley had always been an outlier, even in Slytherin. He wasn't as overtly ambitious as Draco Malfoy or as coldly strategic as Blaise Zabini. Instead, his strengths lay in meticulous observation and an odd knack for remembering overheard snippets of information. He had the mind of a chess player, but he preferred eavesdropping to strategizing, gathering rumors as if they were galleons in Gringotts. By his 6th year, his grades, especially in arithmancy and ancient runes, had begun to outshine even the brightest of Ravenclaws. He had a near-perfect memory and had taught himself 5 different magical codes by the age of 16. Professors Flitwick and Vector petitioned for his transfer, hoping that a change in environment would develop his academic potential. The Sorting Hat, consulted in an unusual mid-term ceremony, agreed reluctantly. Thus Bletchley crossed the threshold of Ravenclaw Tower, armed with intellect, but lacking something far more critical. He walked into Ravenclaw as a Slytherin in Ravenclaw robes. The house welcomed him with polite detachment. Terry Boot and Padma Patil observed him with mild curiosity. Michael Corner muttered about the dangers of letting snakes into the eagle's nest. But Bletchley didn't care for their opinions. He saw the transfer as an endorsement, a validation of his superiority. He began to attend study groups, quote obscure magical theorists, and dazzle younger students with explanations of wand mechanics. Yet even as he recited the distinctions between thaumaturgic transfer and transductive charm, a deeper wisdom eluded him. He never stopped eavesdropping. Even within the walls of Ravenclaw Tower, Bletchley would cast listening charms under the pretense of researching acoustic spells. He once spent 2 hours outside Professor McGonagall's office, hidden beneath an invisibility cloak he had borrowed from the Room of Requirement, listening to a meeting between McGonagall, Professor Sprout, and a visiting official from the Department of Magical Education. What he heard that day would lead to one of the most absurd and intellectually embarrassing episodes in recent Hogwarts memory. The meeting had been centered around proposed reforms at the Ministry, rumors that standardized testing would be replaced by practical field evaluations, and that certain archaic spells would be removed from the curriculum. McGonagall, ever the realist, had expressed skepticism. Sprout worried about the strain it would place on younger students. The official, one Osric Langley, had said, "We're discussing a temporary suspension of albuels in the case of a national emergency, though such emergencies are, of course, entirely hypothetical." But Bletchley, who had only caught fragments of the conversation through a poorly anchored charm, emerged from his hiding place convinced that albuels were cancelled, not hypothetically, immediately. He told Padma first, then Morag MacDougall. By nightfall, the rumour had spread like fiend fire through the dormitories. "The Ministry's abolishing exams," whispered a 5th-year boy to his gobsmacked friend. "No more owls, no more newts." Students cheered in hallways. Homework was gleefully abandoned. A group of jubilant Hufflepuffs used a shrinking charm to flush their Transfiguration textbooks down the prefect's bathroom drain. It would have been funny had it not also been terrifyingly plausible in the climate of those days. But Bletchley had misunderstood something else, something more dangerous. He had also overheard Sprout express concern about the possibility of school-wide evacuation drills in the event of another attack like the one at the Department of Mysteries. To her, it was a theoretical precaution. To Bletchley, it was a coded warning. Within 2 days, panic set in. Whispers about a coming evacuation crept into breakfast conversations. Some students began sending owls to their parents. Others packed emergency bags under their beds. A group of Ravenclaws barricaded the tower one night with locking charms so complex that even Flitwick needed an hour to undo them. The entire school was teetering between apathy and hysteria, and at the centre of it all stood Miles Bletchley, unaware that he had confused cautionary discussion with confirmed policy. Flitwick, bewildered by the chaos, summoned Bletchley and asked where he had heard such information. "I overheard McGonagall and a ministry official," Bletchley admitted with a trace of smugness. "They said it plainly, no more exams and the school's going into lockdown." Flitwick's brow furrowed. He sent word to McGonagall, who clarified the situation. The truth, when revealed, landed like a bad potion. Owls were not cancelled. Evacuations were not planned. The entire debacle had stemmed from one student misinterpreting an overheard conversation. McGonagall was furious. "What Bletchley did," she told the faculty, "was not simply foolish, it was dangerous. We expect our students to question what they hear, not to act as heralds of misinformed panic." Ravenclaw Tower, too, was less than forgiving. Padma Patil, once neutral toward him, refused to speak to him for weeks. Even the younger Ravenclaws, who had once looked up to his academic prowess, now saw him as a cautionary tale. Bletchley became the poster boy not for brilliance, but for its misuse. What made the situation so tragic was not just the consequences, it was the irony. Here was a student whose memory could rival Hermione Granger's, whose understanding of theoretical charms was profound, yet who failed at the most fundamental task of intellectualism, interpretation. He had all the data, but no insight. He could recall 100 incantations, but not the difference between possibility and certainty. Ravenclaws are taught that learning is not the mere accumulation of facts, but the cultivation of discernment. In this, Bletchley failed completely. Even Luna Lovegood, often dismissed as dreamy and eccentric, demonstrated better judgment. When she heard the rumours, she asked, "Did the professors really say that? Or is this another Rackspurt-fueled miscommunication?" Her offhand remark cut deeper than intended. Luna, with her whimsical logic, understood nuance better than the boy who had memorized 1,000 magical laws. Years later, when the Battle of Hogwarts broke the silence of the school, Bletchley was nowhere near the front lines. He had graduated the year before, vanished into some quiet administrative role at the ministry. His name never appeared in any post-war accolades. He didn't fight, he didn't organize, he didn't resist. Some say he tried to relay information to the Order and got the message wrong. No one can confirm it. Rowling never mentioned Bletchley again, save for that passing reference in an obscure post-interview footnote. But those who remembered the rumour, the cancelled exams, the ghostly whispers of an evacuation, would always recall the chaos he left behind. He became a legend in the corridors, not of heroism or wisdom, but of the dangers of unchecked assumptions. Ravenclaws whispered about him during exam season, often with a sardonic laugh. "Don't go full Bletchley," they'd say when someone misread a professor's tone or jumped to a conclusion. What's perhaps most unsettling is how easily it could happen again. In a world where magic amplifies rumour and misinterpretation can spread through enchanted parchment or bewitched mirrors, the story of Miles Bletchley is not a cautionary tale about one boy. It is a mirror to every overconfident student who believes that memory equals meaning. Bletchley's notebooks, when found years later in the room of requirement, were filled with transcripts, meticulous recordings of conversations he had overheard throughout his Hogwarts career. They were coded, of course, but easily broken by Hermione, who once stumbled upon them during a search for room of requirement artifacts. In the margins he had scribbled interpretations. They were often wildly off. A reference to muddy footprints by Hagrid was marked possible centaur movement. A passing comment by Snape about cutting off the head of the problem was labelled plot to eliminate McGonagall. Intelligence without skepticism, memory without wisdom. These are the flaws that Ravenclaw House, for all its merits, is not immune to. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson. Even the cleverest minds can be deceived by the sound of their own certainty. Even in the House of the Eagle, one must learn to see beyond the clouds. Miles Bletchley, the Ravenclaw who didn't think, reminds us that intellect is only the beginning. It is how we use it, how we question, challenge, and refine it, that defines who we truly are. And in that, his failure becomes our warning. Number 23, Ella Bland, burning a rare book mistaken for a fake. Ella Bland was known in Ravenclaw Tower for her intellect, her obsession with obscure magical texts, and an air of quiet superiority that often accompanied the house's brightest. She spent long evenings in the library poring over dusty pages of old spellbooks, deciphering forgotten runes, and correcting professors in class with unnerving precision. Her room, tucked away in one of the tower's higher alcoves, was cluttered with ancient scrolls, enchanted lenses, quills that scribbled by themselves, and tomes that whispered when opened. Her favourite subject was archaic charms, an elective so advanced that only 3 students in the entire school dared to take it during her 7th year. Of those 3, Ella was the unquestioned leader. It was precisely this passion that led her to a peculiar encounter, one rainy Saturday afternoon. Madame Pince had just unboxed a collection of donated books to the restricted section, texts retrieved from a retired unspeakable's estate. Among them lay a thin, leather-bound volume titled Primordia Incantamenta, its title etched in ancient script that shimmered silver under the flickering candlelight. Ella's heart leapt. She had read of this book in fragments, often dismissed as legend, said to contain spells lost even to the founders of Hogwarts. Some whispered that Rowena Ravenclaw herself had once possessed a copy. Ella, with her unmatched confidence in such matters, approached the table and lifted the book with a reverent, yet calculating, touch. The cover was warm, too warm. As she flipped through the brittle pages, she noticed what she believed were inconsistencies: ink that smelled too fresh, parchment that lacked age stains, a watermark not typical of the era. Her instincts screamed forgery. No true relic would preserve itself this perfectly, she later told others. The book bore none of the enchantments typical of ancient texts meant to guard against tampering or theft. There was no biting enchantment, no whispering aura of protection, no coded lock. In Ella's mind, it was all too neat, too convenient. She snapped it shut. The following evening, she took it to the astronomy tower, choosing isolation for the act she believed would prevent the spread of dangerous misinformation. Using a charm she had recently mastered from an older spellbook, Ignis Essentia, fire that burned away magical deceit, she set the book ablaze mid-air. The pages ignited in a brilliant violet flame, swirling upward like ethereal dancers before disintegrating into sparkling ash. It was done in seconds. Ella stood in the glow of her own self-assurance, convinced she had prevented some future Ravenclaw from falling for a clever imitation. But word spread. The following week, Professor Bathory, who taught archaic charms and who had served as the head of the Ravenclaw house for nearly 2 decades, arrived in class with trembling hands. "The book you destroyed," he said without looking at Ella, "was not a copy. It was one of 3 verified editions last catalogued in the French Ministry archives in 1837. He paused, his voice brittle. "It was enchanted to appear unremarkable, to evade dark collectors. You mistook protective charm for modern deception." Ella didn't move. The class fell silent. Students glanced at her, not with admiration, but with something close to disbelief. The cleverest witch in the room, the girl who corrected 7th-year essays as a 3rd year, had just annihilated a piece of magical history. Her stomach churned. The pit of her pride, once solid, now cracked. She had not even performed a verification spell. Whispers began in the corridors. Some students were kind. Anyone could have made that mistake, they said, but most weren't. A Ravenclaw should have known better. Even the portraits had their judgments. Damara Goodfellow, a 14th-century duelist, whose portrait hung by the staircase, was overheard scoffing, I've seen Slytherins more cautious with their cauldrons." The shame settled over Ella like a shroud. She began revisiting every book she had ever claimed to understand. She spent nights casting authenticity spells she had previously dismissed as redundant. She wrote to the French ministry, admitting what had happened, begging for guidance, hoping perhaps a backup copy had survived somewhere in a dusty vault. There wasn't. In time, the incident became a case study. Professor Bathory included it in the final exam. Describe how magical arrogance may hinder rational analysis, referencing historical examples such as the Bland incident. Even students from other houses began quoting it. "Don't pull a Bland," Gryffindors joked when someone jumped to conclusions. The phrase wormed its way into the lexicon of Hogwarts. Ella, once lauded for her speed in thought and deduction, now understood the weight of restraint. She started attending Professor Sprout's lectures, studying how slow-growing magical herbs held truths invisible to hasty eyes. She joined a Hufflepuff research group that practiced magical patience, the deliberate slowing of magical conclusions until each spell's intention could be tested 3 times. Her fellow Ravenclaws, initially wary, began to see a change in her. Not just humility, but wisdom. One night, while reorganizing the archaic section of the library, a self-imposed punishment, she stumbled upon a phrase scrawled in the margin of a tome. It read, "Even Rowena questioned her first conclusion." The ink was faded, but Ella traced the words gently, as though touching a scar. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to cry. Years later, when she applied for a post at the Department of Mysteries, the evaluators asked her to name the gravest magical mistake she had ever made. She told them everything, not with shame, but with full clarity. "I burned knowledge," she said, "because I thought I had outsmarted it." They hired her the following week. In a letter she later wrote to Professor Bathory, Ella described her new project, cataloguing rare magical texts and developing enchantments that would preserve authenticity while still signaling their value to younger witches and wizards. "Had Primordia Incantamenta been marked with a clear glyph," she wrote, "perhaps I would have paused, perhaps not. But now I understand the importance of transparency for future generations." Bathory never responded directly, but the next time she visited Hogwarts, she found a single book left for her in the archaic charms classroom. Its title was embossed in gold, and beneath it was a handwritten dedication to Ella Bland, who learned that wisdom is not born from speed, but from reflection. The fire she conjured that night had consumed more than paper. It devoured pride. But from the ashes, Ella rebuilt herself into a scholar whose name would, ironically, be remembered not for brilliance alone, but for the lesson her mistake taught the magical world. In the Hogwarts library, a new section was quietly added to the restricted shelves, Recovered Truths. The first plaque reads, "Dedicated to the vigilant curiosity of Ella Bland. May caution serve intellect, always." To this day, young Ravenclaws whisper the story on stormy nights, often glancing toward the Astronomy Tower's spire. Some claim they can see faint violet sparks on the wind, others swear the tower remembers, and in one of the lesser-known footnotes of Hogwarts, a history added in the most recent edition is a quiet mention. In the early 21st century, an original edition of Primordia Incantamenta was accidentally destroyed by a student of great promise. The incident became a turning point in magical archival protocols. No name is mentioned, but Ravenclaws know. Ella Bland had failed by her own standards. She had allowed emotion to override logic, assumption to replace verification. Her fall was not dramatic nor public in the way of duels or expulsion. It was quiet, a personal collapse that echoed through the school like a chime of broken glass. And yet, her recovery was 1,000 times more powerful than the moment of destruction. The incident became a paradox in the minds of students, the cleverest witch making the costliest mistake. But to the true Ravenclaw spirit, it served as a deeper reminder. Intelligence is not infallible. Wit must be sharpened not just with knowledge, but with humility. Ella's name faded from the gossip after some years, but it lived on in essays, footnotes, and the cautious hands of young witches holding old books with reverence. Somewhere, a student touches a page twice before turning it, just to be sure. Somewhere, a would-be Ella hesitates, and in that hesitation, the book is saved. Number 24, Ambrosia Furnace, Guessing Riddle Answers, instead of solving them. Ambrosia Furnace was not the type of Ravenclaw student others expected to meet upon entering the famed tower that bore the emblem of the eagle. Where most of her housemates displayed keen intellect and a love for puzzles and riddles, Ambrosia had, rather unconventionally, found the riddles tiresome, and worse, utterly unfair. Her fellow third years often whispered that she was brilliant when she wanted to be, that she could recite entire sections of magical theory by Adelbert Waffling or quote obscure magical poets from memory. But when it came to the enchanted bronze knocker guarding the Ravenclaw common room, her brilliance took a rather unorthodox turn. It began during her first term at Hogwarts. Like every Ravenclaw, Ambrosia faced the test that stood at the door: answer a riddle posed by the knocker, or wait for someone else who could. At first, she attempted them with sincere effort. Which came first, the phoenix or the flame? The door once asked. She had sat down, closed her eyes, and debated with herself. Hours later, with her knees cold from the stone floor, she admitted defeat, and a passing sixth year answered on her behalf. The embarrassment of waiting, not the failure itself, ignited something inside her that would shape her future approach. Ambrosia began to notice a pattern in the riddles. They were meant to provoke not just logical reasoning, but creative interpretation. That frustrated her deeply. If they wanted logic, she muttered one day in the great hall to an unsuspecting fourth year, they should teach arithmancy riddles, not philosophical nonsense. And with that, she took out a spare bit of parchment and began writing down every answer that had ever opened the door. They must repeat eventually, she said to herself, and compiled what became known as Furnace's list. The list began with 10 answers, simple phrases like a circle, time, nothing, a shadow, a dream. She added to it religiously, hoping to create a kind of master key to the riddles. By the end of her second year, the list had grown to nearly 100 potential responses, a curious mix of metaphors, abstract concepts, and logical conclusions. But her faith in this strategy only further revealed her misunderstanding of the Ravenclaw spirit. In her third year, Ambrosia's reliance on the list became a spectacle. A crowd of students would gather behind her as she stood before the eagle-shaped knocker, muttering her list under her breath, trying each one as though she were casting a spell. Time, she'd try, nothing. A shadow. Silence. An idea. Still nothing. Sometimes the door would creak slightly open, as if mocking her attempts. But more often, it remained stubbornly shut. Her impatience grew. Where others treated the riddles as a moment of daily reflection or a challenge to be embraced, Ambrosia saw them as a nuisance. "It's a bottleneck," she grumbled to her friend Calliope Greenwell one frosty evening, "a bottleneck that slows down real learning." She failed to see that to many Ravenclaws the riddles were part of the learning itself, an invitation to think differently, to pause, to stretch the mind in unexpected directions. The irony of her situation was not lost on others. Professor Flitwick himself once commented to Madame Pomfrey in passing, "Ambrosia Furnace has the mind of a duelist, sharp and instinctive, but sometimes misses the elegance of the duel." It was a diplomatic way of saying what many of her peers already whispered. Ambrosia had intellect, but she had grown suspicious of its most sacred expressions. The most infamous incident occurred in the spring of her fourth year. A particularly difficult riddle was asked by the door. What is seen once in a minute, twice in a moment, and never in 1,000 years. Ambrosia, who had just returned from the library carrying a fresh copy of Numerology and Grammatica, stood before the door and began her recital. She read from her list for nearly 20 minutes. A small line of students had formed behind her. Some chuckled, others sighed. Then came her breaking point. "I've said nothing, everything, the wind an illusion, the moon hope." She paused. "It's nonsense," she spat, shoving the parchment into her robe. "Completely illogical." She stormed off, leaving the others to answer. A second-year girl quietly whispered the letter M, and the door swung open immediately. This event cemented Ambrosia's place in house legend, not for brilliance, but for the strange contradiction she embodied, a Ravenclaw who resisted the very traits her house held dear. While some students failed the riddles from lack of skill or vocabulary, Ambrosia failed them by trying to game the system. She had approached intellect as a blunt instrument, not a dance. Years later, in the Hogwarts library's records, her name is mentioned in a side note in Ravenclaw House, a history of minds and magic. Ambrosia Furnace, a curious case, sharp of memory, quick in debate, but whose trust in memorized answers eclipsed her capacity to contemplate. It was not an insult, but a gentle reminder of what Ravenclaw demanded. Her roommates, particularly Ione Travers, a quiet and contemplative student who enjoyed riddles for their poetic nature, often tried to help Ambrosia see them differently. "It's not about tricking the door," Ione once told a group over breakfast. "It's about meeting the door where it lives in questions, not answers." But Ambrosia shrugged such statements off. "Doors don't live," she would reply. By her 5th year, Ambrosia had abandoned the list, but replaced it with something worse. She simply waited. She would linger near the door, eyes scanning the corridor for someone approaching. If she heard the knocker speak, she didn't even try anymore. She let others do the thinking, then slid in after them with barely a nod. The door knocker never objected. It was enchanted to pose questions. Not enforce who answered. Some students began to pity her, others mocked. But Ravenclaws being what they are, the reaction was largely thoughtful. An essay appeared on the house bulletin board, anonymous, but clearly written by someone who had been observing. It was titled Intelligence as Will. It read, in part, "To think is not only to store answers, but to risk wrong ones. Ambrosia Furnace has made the grave mistake of choosing certainty over thought. She does not lack a mind, she lacks the willingness to enter the space between knowing and not knowing." The essay struck a chord. Students began to talk about the nature of intellect in a more nuanced way. Some even said Ambrosia had, unwittingly, taught them more than many formal lessons, not through triumph, but through contradiction. Her failures highlighted the hidden curriculum of Ravenclaw House, the importance of wonder, humility, and curiosity. Ambrosia herself, unaware of her newfound role as a cautionary example, focused more and more on factual mastery. She won academic awards in potions and transfiguration. She was praised by Professor Sinistra for her detailed star charts. She even tutored struggling first years in basic spellcasting, but the common room door remained her nemesis. She still refused to speak about riddles, and her peers knew better than to bring them up. In her final year, something changed. One morning, she arrived at the door just as the knocker asked, "If you have me, you want to share me. If you share me, you don't have me. What am I?" She paused, then sighed. For once, she didn't pull out a list. She didn't wait. She simply closed her eyes, leaned against the doorframe, and whispered, "A secret." The door opened. A first year behind her gasped. "Did you know the answer?" he asked. She turned to him, shrugged, and said, "No, but I thought about it." That was the only time she ever admitted to thinking instead of reciting. Her reputation didn't change overnight, but those who witnessed it remembered. Ione Travers wrote in her diary that night, Ambrosia has finally glimpsed the truth of Ravenclaw. Not all knowledge lives in books. Some of it waits at doors. Ambrosia Furnace graduated with honours. Her name was carved into the Ravenclaw Cup for her contributions in astronomy. Yet the memory that lived on was not her academic success, but her transformation in front of the door. Years later, a new generation of Ravenclaws would hear her story, not as a tale of failure, but of redemption. For in a house where cleverness is prized, Ambrosia reminded them all that intelligence is not merely what one knows, it is what one is willing to learn, even if it means standing silently before a door, uncertain, with no list to lean on. Number 25. Laura Moon, starting a gnome revolution in the Hogwarts kitchen. At the heart of Ravenclaw Tower, where intelligence, wit and wisdom were supposed to shape the identity of its students, lived a girl whose ideas were as chaotic as they were imaginative. Laura Moon, a fifth-year Ravenclaw, was not the typical textbook prodigy. Her essays were dazzlingly poetic, though often veered into the philosophical abstract. She could debate the ethics of dragon breeding or the morality of memory charms for hours, usually leaving the listener dizzy, if not entirely convinced. But above all, Laura was a crusader, not for academic trophies or points for her house, but for causes, usually ones no one else thought needed defending. Laura had spent weeks pacing between the library and the kitchens, her robes often dusted with flour or bits of parchment. She had become obsessed with the condition of the Hogwarts house elves, convinced that beneath their cheerful facade was a system of magical servitude that required immediate dismantling. Other Ravenclaws nodded sympathetically when she launched into one of her tirades during supper, but few truly shared her concern. "They like their work," said Sue Lee cautiously one evening, as Laura refused to eat the treacle tart on grounds of ethical objection. But Laura's mind was made up. If history had taught her anything, it was that oppressed people rarely recognized their chains. When her pamphlets, handwritten and enchanted to sparkle with tiny, revolutionary fireworks, were ignored by both students and elves alike, Laura retreated into a corner of the Ravenclaw common room with a pile of obscure wizarding history books. It was there that she stumbled across a mention of a garden gnome uprising in Cornwall in 1762. The rebellion had lasted only 3 hours and ended with most of the gnomes falling into a well, but for Laura, it was a sign. If house elves would not fight for themselves, she would find another magical species to bear the torch. Her next steps were daring, if not entirely logical. With a quick Expelliarmus to distract Hagrid's attention and a borrowed invisibility cloak, rumoured to belong to a 7th-year Hufflepuff with an alarming disregard for personal boundaries, Laura smuggled 7 garden gnomes from the pumpkin patch into the castle. She kept them hidden beneath her bed in a magically expanded shoebox lined with old copies of the Quibbler. She fed them biscuits and whispered manifestos into their ears late at night. "You are not vermin," she told them solemnly. "You are the spark of a new era." The gnomes were less interested in political reform and more fascinated by buttered crumpets, but Laura was undeterred. She named them after obscure revolutionaries, Trotsky, Lavinia, Barnabas the Balmy, and so on. She charmed tiny red sashes onto their rotund bodies and taught them to march in formation using enchanted metronomes. The Ravenclaws pretended not to notice. Perhaps they assumed it was some odd extracurricular project, or perhaps, having seen Laura's previous attempt to enchant a cauldron into dancing for elf justice, they simply gave up questioning her. On the morning of February the 3rd, as snow drifted softly over the windows and students tucked into breakfast, Laura made her move. She sent the gnomes marching down the corridor from Ravenclaw Tower to the kitchens, enchanted brass whistles sounding the call. Her plan was deceptively simple. Liberate the kitchens, replace the elves with a council of equal labor, and announce the new magical order during lunch in the Great Hall. But things began to unravel almost immediately. The gnomes, rather than storming the kitchens in an orderly line, became distracted by the smell of meat pies cooling on a windowsill near the Hufflepuff common room. Chaos erupted. One gnome bit a passing first year on the ankle, causing the poor boy to shriek and drop his stack of charms homework. Another gnome broke into the storeroom and began hurling pickled onions at a portrait of a laughing friar. Within minutes, 3 prefects and 1 ghost were involved in damage control. By the time the gnomes reached the Great Hall, the revolution had turned into a riot. They swarmed the long Gryffindor table, overturning goblets of pumpkin juice and stealing bread rolls. Peeves, sensing the potential for maximum disruption, joined in enthusiastically, singing Gnomes of Glory to the tune of the school anthem while pelting the staff table with levitated pudding. Professor Sinistra ducked just in time to avoid a flying roast chicken. In the kitchens, the house elves watched the commotion through the enchanted fireplace and shook their heads in confusion. "We likes our work," muttered Dobby's cousin, Maury, to no one in particular, stirring a pot of stew with practiced ease. No elf joined the uprising. No elf wanted to. It was, as Maury later told Professor McGonagall, the strangest Tuesday we ever had. When the dust finally settled, several gnomes had vanished into the dungeons. One had been captured and tied to a chair by a group of overly zealous Slytherins who assumed it was a new defense against the dark arts test, and Laura stood amidst the chaos like a general surveying a battlefield littered with mashed potatoes. Her robes were torn, her glasses askew, but her eyes shone with the fervour of someone utterly convinced of her righteousness. Professor McGonagall arrived in a flurry of tartan and frost, her expression unreadable. She listened to Laura's breathless explanation with arms crossed tightly, her foot tapping in quiet fury. It was one of those rare occasions when Minerva didn't raise her voice. Her silence did all the damage necessary. When she finally spoke, it was with the measured restraint of someone who had lived through the twin catastrophes of Fred and George Weasley and still harboured hope for humanity. "You will write a 20-foot essay," McGonagall said coolly, "on the ethics of magical agency and why garden gnomes are not in fact an oppressed proletariat." Laura opened her mouth, presumably to argue, but the headmistress raised a single finger. "And you will clean the entire kitchens with the elves' permission, using no magic whatsoever." Laura accepted her punishment with an air of martyrdom. "History will absolve me," she muttered as she began scrubbing cauldrons. The elves, to their credit, treated her kindly. One even knitted her a pair of gloves when her hands began to crack from the cold water. Professor Flitwick, who had watched the events unfold with a bemused twinkle in his eye, offered only a gentle shake of the head and a sigh when he passed her in the corridor later that week. 10 points for creativity," he murmured, half to himself. "But Merlin help us if she ever finds out about the Centaur's labour complaints." Laura's misadventure became the stuff of whispered legend. Younger students recounted the story with admiration or horror, depending on their opinion of gnomes. Filch, who had been called to help round up the rogue creatures, insisted on a weekly gnome patrol for months afterward, muttering about little devils with teeth like razors. The gnome who'd been tied to the chair eventually escaped and made a permanent home beneath the potions classroom, where it occasionally stole beetle eyes from Snape's stores. In the months that followed, Laura remained undeterred. Her mind leapt from cause to cause with unrelenting fervour. She tried to start a petition demanding equal representation for magical portraits in Hogwarts governance. She designed badges that read wands for werewolves. At one point, she attempted to teach a colony of fire crabs to tap dance in protest of ministry regulations. None of these ventures succeeded, but all were pursued with the same wild-eyed dedication. Some said she was brilliant, others said she was mad. But the truth, perhaps, lay somewhere between. Ravenclaws were known for intellect, yes, but also for eccentricity, for unconventional wisdom and offbeat truths. Laura Moon embodied that paradox entirely. Her mistake was not one of stupidity, it was one of misplaced logic, a failure not in thought, but in understanding her audience. The elves did not need saving, the gnomes did not need liberation, but Laura needed a cause, a crusade, a windmill at which to tilt. As Luna Lovegood once wrote in The Quibbler, just because your wings are made of paper doesn't mean you shouldn't try to fly. Laura Moon, with her paper wings and revolutionary fervour, tried to fly where others saw no sky. She crashed, of course, but she crashed spectacularly, and perhaps that in the end was very Ravenclaw indeed.